Okay, welcome everyone to our session today, which we're so excited to have this time together and to share some of our thinking with you. Before I begin, I pay homage to Australia's original storytellers and express my deep gratitude to Aboriginal community elders, past, in perpetuity, present and emerging. I acknowledge that I live and work on what is and always was Aboriginal land, in this case the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Thank you to my fellow Australians for what you have taught me about storytelling and country. So I'm going to begin with some housekeeping things, which is really not my forte literally, but we'll begin there. I'm going to introduce myself and my fellow panellists and give you a bit of a rundown of how the session will go today. So my name's Julia Prendergast. I'm a senior lecturer in writing and literature at Swinburne, a job I love and a job that I feel really lucky to have, especially in our current climate. Not only to be doing work that I'm passionate about, to be talking to people about storytelling and ideas on a daily basis, but as I said, also so many people doing it really tough in this climate. So I feel inordinately grateful to have a job. I write long and short form fiction. I'm a bit of a short story addict, and my novel, which was published in 2018 by the University of Western Australia Publishing, most of the chapters in that novel were actually published as short stories along the way. So I kind of I've used short form fiction as a way of building towards longer form fiction. Not consciously, but anyway, that's how it's gone for me. A couple of my most recent stories are in the current edition of Australian Short Stories, and there's other information about my fiction in my bio. So if you're interested, you're welcome to look it up there. It's my privilege and pleasure today to be in conversation with Jen and with Olivia, and I'm going to introduce them formally, and then we'll get into the guts of the session. So Jen Nguyen is the author of a poetry collection, When I Die, Slingshot My Ashes Onto the Surface of the Moon. What a title, hey? So such a gorgeous title. Jen has been published in Scum Mag, Sick Leave Journal, Meanjin Blog and the City of Literature Summer Series, among others, and has performed at the Emerging Writers Festival, the Melbourne Writers Festival, West Writers Forum, as well as Liminal Presents Lucky and Synthetic Heat. In 2019, Jen was awarded a Wheeler Centre Hot Desk Fellowship, and Jen won the Day 3 Swinburne Microfiction Challenge in 2018, and we're going to have a talk about that gorgeous story a bit later on. Olivia Muscat's personal essays appear in the anthologies Meet Me at the Intersection, Fremantle Press, Growing Up Disabled in Australia. Her theatre criticism appears on Witness Performance, and she has other writing in places like Kill Your Darlings and Baby Teeth Journal. In 2019, Olivia was awarded an Arts Access Victoria Leslie Hall Scholarship to work on her novel for young readers. And Olivia lives in Melbourne with her guide dog, Jemima, where she teaches drama and writing to kids and teens and advocates for better disability access in the arts. Olivia was a contributor to the Writers Victoria Flash Fiction Challenge earlier this year, and we're going to hear a couple of those pieces and have some discussion about where they came from. So welcome, Jen and Olivia. As I said, it's such a privilege and pleasure to share this time with you today, and to have engaged with your work and your thinking in the lead up to this session has been really gorgeous. I guess this is one of the one of the silver lining things about slow time, in our new virtual world is sometimes we're engaging with people a bit differently, and that has actually been really gorgeous. So final couple of pieces of housekeeping. To those of you joining us from your own virtual spaces, please send us questions as you think of them as we progress. We're going to move to questions in about the last 15 minutes of the session. And please send your questions via Twitter at #EWF20, and the entirely delightful team at EWF will send those questions through to us. Feel free to address questions to us as a panel, or you may have questions in particular for each of us, which is entirely fine. Okay, so finally, by way of housekeeping, I'd like to note that in the event description today, we've promised you a microfiction clinic. And so we hope that the session today leaves you overflowing with ideas for your own short form writing and inspired to put your new skills to the test in the Swinburne Microfiction Challenge. This exciting opportunity begins today and runs from the 16th to the 20th of June. The prompt today, if you haven't caught that via email or other channels, is guts. And we were just beginning to have a quick chat about that when we were due to go live. So I hope we can circle around to that at the end. So each day, if you're not familiar with how this works, each day there will be a prompt such as guts today released, and you're invited to send your short stories up to 500 words. The entries will be judged by short story experts at Going Down Swinging and Swinburne Uni. You can submit once, twice during the challenge, and there are up to 5 opportunities to win. Daily winners will be published in Going Down Swinging, and there's an award of $1,000 for the overall winner. So please send your work, and as I say today, we're going to do our best to give you some, I don't know, ideas about where our work come from, in the hope that the thing I love best about talking to writers about their work and hearing about their stories is that I think it's so generative, that writing this kind of talk is art generates art. So that's what we hope today. The format is really brief discussion in the beginning about what has drawn each of us to the form, to short writing. I call it sudden writing. We'll get to that. And then we hope to do a couple of rounds where we talk about to each of our pieces of writing and ask each other questions about that. As I said, your questions are welcome too, and some kind of tips and tricks that have helped us along the way. So that's housekeeping aside in 8 minutes according to my clock, so we're on time so far. So Jen, I'm going to begin with you, and I wonder if you would speak to us about what draws you to the short form, whether it's got a kind of a conscious thing you think about, or what it is about the form that appeals to you.
So first of all, hi everyone, thanks for joining us, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, Julia and Olivia. As to short form writing, I personally love it very, very, very much. I think that it's very playful and flexible, and it doesn't necessarily need to stick to the elements of conventional fiction or storytelling, though of course it can. I often turn to reading and writing microfiction for its brevity, yet extraordinary depth, because I don't need to know everything about a character or the character's world in order to feel invested in the story. Personally for me, I like microfiction that's lyrically and emotionally charged, has some stakes and tension to the piece, and leaves me feeling transformed by the end of it. But of course, I also don't mind microfiction that's pared back, balanced, and simply well written.
Thank you, Jen. That's a lovely kickoff. And Olivia, can I invite you to add on and tell us why you're drawn to short storytelling?
Of course. And hi everyone. I'm honoured to be here discussing short form writing with you, Julia and Jen, and put my 2 cents into the conversation. I really like the words Jen just used, playful and flexible. That's something I really love about this form as well. You can do so much with so few words. I love seeing the way a story can change, and is there an Australian expression for turning on a dime? Like, just flip over so quickly in so few words. And I love experimenting with how much meaning and emotion and atmosphere you can include in such a story. There was something else I wanted to say. Oh, and I just adore the way short form writing, it captures a feeling or a moment in time or just one single thought with such clarity. Something so satisfying about something so short and so complete. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Olivia. I love the short form for many of the reasons that both of you describe. And when you talk about that turning on a dime, is there an Australian word for this turning on a dime thing? I've been reading these collections of short form writing called sudden writing, and these books published in the States first of all, but they include Australian authors, the follow-up ones. And I think it's that suddenness when you say something's happening and then there's a sudden switch. And I see this in both of your writing where we're flipped, as you say. There's a sudden flip. One of my eldest son, said to me as I was talking to Jen and Olivia about, I don't know why you're so obsessed with short stories. We just come to know people and then they're gone. And I think that that's true. And I think it's actually one of the reasons that I love it so much. That I've just gone totally blank here. I hope you can still hear me because I've just.
We can still hear you.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but I'm back. And it's so that suddenness, that capturing the capacity of short form to capture the incompleteness of human experience is how I describe it. And the sense, as you say, Jen, that we actually don't need to know everything. That one anecdote or one tiny telling detail can tell us so much about a person that we actually don't need everything. So there's the kind of context for what I describe as myself anyway as being a bit of a short story addict, and I think I'm in the company of other short story addicts here today. So we're going to get to the work itself, and it's a little bit meta and a little bit micro in keeping with the panel, but I love this way of having authors unpack their story as a way of coming to understand them perhaps in a different way again. So, Jen, I'm going to begin with one of your stories. As I said, I've had the pleasure of reading both of your work over the last couple of weeks, and really grateful to have had that opportunity. I'm going to begin with Please Don't Eat My Eggs, which, as I said in the introduction, won the Swinburne Microfiction Challenge on day 3 in 2018. For listeners who would like to read the full version of this entry, you can find it at Seizure Online. And I'm going to ask Jen to read a very short extract from this story, and then I'm going to ask you a question about it. Please, Jen.
Sure. I am reading a book where my mother tongue is perfectly woven into the story. I am jealous of how a word can be held in a mouth without it slipping away, given life with every breath, muscled into existence. Tonight, the red moon melts like a burning photograph. I mistake boredom for restlessness, scroll through social media, liking things I don't really like, affirm my presence in what little ways I can at 4 a.m. My therapist says I have the habit of mistaking loss for something recoverable.
Wow. So I kind of hate to talk after that because I would like to sit with it, but that's not the point, right? It's a remarkably poetic piece of work, the entire piece itself, remarkably poetic and dense. And I think this is the nature of probably short form. Some people talk about the relationship of short form writing and poetry. The capacity of brevity to contain so much more. I also think when I read this story, which is not in this extract, about how the story is beautifully bookended by boiled eggs, which obviously is a concrete and specific detail in the story, but comes metaphorically to mean so much more than it is. So I'm wondering, Jen, if you could talk us through this story, tell us where it came from, perhaps what details were drawn from life, or how you embellish those details, and if you can, and I know this is kind of super meta question, but if you can give our listeners an idea of your work, of how you handle association and metaphor in this story and your work more broadly.
Yeah, I'd love to. So as you mentioned in the discussions we had leading up to this session, that it's a stream of consciousness piece. And you're right, it's very much pulled directly from my real life. I tend to work through the night, when it's a bit more quiet, contemplating what goes on during the day. So the prompt for day 3 was spoke. So when I saw the prompt, I thought about all the different ways of communicating and what it means to communicate and why, and specifically what it means to me to communicate and why. So I wrote the piece all in one go in the stream of consciousness kind of style, just because, that comes a lot more easier. And then I went back to edit it so that I had a nice narrative flow to it. It didn't go through too many drafts, this one. I think it was 2 drafts for structure and then 1 or 2 for line edits. And I think that's the beauty of the 24-hour window that the microfiction competition gives you. You can't spend too much time agonizing over every little detail, which I think then results in some really good raw writing. As for the metaphors and associations you mentioned the piece has, I think the key is paying close attention to the world around us, doing things like noticing, witnessing, reflecting. You'll find that there's a lot of lovely little surprises and all the things that populate our world, but also paying close attention to yourself and honoring your own feelings and unique viewpoint on things, because yeah, everyone's got the same prompt, but there will definitely be so many different unique entries. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. I hope you listeners are making notes, and I wish that I could too, because there's so many beautiful things to pick up on there. The rawness, I think, is such a you know, like a trademark of sudden kind of writing, and I think it's very true that sometimes when we have the time to go back and edit our work, you know, that's when I know a work is finished, if I change something and I'm not sure if it was better before. And I agree with you that we don't have the opportunity to do as much of that when we have a short window. And yeah, and this kind of sense, as you say, of paying attention, you know, I call that acute listening, and I don't mean just sound. And so I think that is so very true. And I think as writers, often we're listening for the sound of what something means, not just at the level of the sentence, but you know, in a broader metaphorical sense. So thank you for that gorgeous answer. I'm going to move to one, and Jen and Olivia, as discussed, please interrupt anytime with your own questions. Like, we've got a bit of a loose format that we're going to follow, but you know, we haven't tracked these answers, so if you please feel free to jump in and with your own questions anytime. So I'm moving now to Olivia's work, and in particular an entry that was submitted to the Writers Victoria Flash Fiction Challenge. And because Flash is the micro of the micro, I'm going to ask you to read this day 23 entry in full, please, Olivia, and together with the prompt for that day, and then I'll have a question for you about that.
Of course. So the prompt for day 23 was read, and the story I came up with is, I only read literary fiction. Plus, you can't say you read if you're listening to audiobooks. I left him and never looked back. Zero time for pseudo-intellectual ableist snobbery.
So gorgeous, and once again, I'd like to sit and pause with that for a minute. And if we're in real time with the luxury of more time, of course we could. One of the questions, so many questions, but one of the questions that I'd love to hear about, Olivia, and I think that our audience would too, is how your short, because you write across a number, you write across in a number of ways and across a number of forms. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to this particular piece and how it relates, for example, to your contribution to growing up disabled in Australia. And more broadly, how your life informs your work across the platforms that you write.
Yeah, well, my life, I'll start with that question, I think. My life informs all the work I do, I think, because, well, for starters, I used to come to all my writing. I never wanted to write about disability or blindness. And so I think I ended up distancing myself. And I think once I realized that, hey, I'm allowed to tell my story, I'm allowed to talk about being a disabled woman, I can be angry or, you know, say whatever I want, basically. It's my writing. I think it's made my writing better for it. So whether I'm writing a fiction, like a long form novel, or this tiny little story, or my non-fiction work, it's always informed by my life experiences of ableism, of access, of all those things. And maybe I write something that's not about those things, but my work, I always come with that lens now. And I think it's made me a better writer for it. But this story, for example, the prompt was read. And that word has so much, for want of a better word, it has so much baggage for me. Because I love to read, like words are my thing. But, you know, I've had people tell me this exact thing. What, reading audiobooks? That's not reading. You're cheating. I'm like, sorry, that's the option I have. Or, you know, other forms of electronic stuff, and people, you know, it's not a hard copy book. It doesn't count. Well, excuse me. So, you know, and especially this year with the Writers Victoria Flash Fiction Challenge, the overall theme was focus. So many of the words had to do with eyes and seeing and stuff. So they all kind of, I brought this experience to all of them. And some days I chose to ignore it. But some days, like for the day of read, I chose to explicitly acknowledge my experience with those sort of things and blindness. And I could rant for hours about this story. It could have turned into a novel, honestly. But I love this moment of, you know, that's it. I'm getting up. I'm leaving. This is a bullshit quote. Like, I love that about short fiction. It forces me to sort of condense my ambles into these clear moments in time. I don't know if that made sense.
Oh gosh, that made it's such an insightful and intuitive response. And when you talk, I think this is a lovely thing about prompts, is that words are loaded in particular ways for all of us, aren't they? And so when you say this could have been a novel, the way in which the voice resounds in this superb piece, we can hear that. And this is what I mean about this kind of acute listening, when we're forced to come back to this minute form. It must contain so much more than what it is, and so the response to the prompt, I think, becomes loaded too. But the voice, the resounding voice, I love when you talk about, I would call it permission, and how you've given yourself permission, if you like, for want of a better phrase, to get right to the guts of what you're talking about. So that I read, as I said, I read them all, and this was one of the ones that I thought, gosh, we have to talk about this one today. So I'm going to move to you, Olivia, now, because I think you have a question for me about about Hallway, and
I do.
Would you like to ask the question first, or would you like me to read that short section first?
I think the short section first.
Okay, thank you.
Should hear what we're working with.
Okay, this is from a piece called Hallway, and it's in free access online in a special issue of Text Journal called The Incompleteness of Human Experience. Sometimes at night I walk from room to room and listen to their breathing. With some of them I can get really close without invading their dreams, so close that I can feel the vibrations of their breath like when they were babies. I walk from room to room collecting their breathing. Later, I stand in the hallway of unused things and I put their breathing together in my mind, listening for things I shouldn't be able to hear. I wish I was a horse so I could stand here all night. I could sleep, not sleep, standing in media res among the things we're letting go of.
Got shivers.
I know. I just want to, like Julia was saying, I just want to sit there in silence and just absorb and sit with it. We'll move on. I love the story. And it captures such a unique moment in time, but it's also universal in its depiction of love. It obviously relates to the virus and isolation, which we don't get from that little extract, but I read the whole piece because it's so wonderful. And isolation, is it based on your own life? And how do you decide what to reveal of yourself in your writing? And is it something you do often and intentionally? I know I find it a little bit easier to write my life and my own experiences in shorter formats. How do you feel about that?
Wow, that's it's such an insightful question, and because I've been talking to writing mates a lot about this since since lockdown. So I write fiction, and my novel is overtly fictional. I think that, I love what Carver has to say in the sense that fiction doesn't come out of thin air. It comes from a spark. And I always think that if I look back to any short story or my longer work, I can mark the sparks in life and anecdotes, something I experienced or heard, usually something that I found really haunting, actually, that I can't get out of my mind, and writing is a way of exorcising that, the haunting of something. So in my longer short stories, I usually begin with a spark, like Carver talks about, and work and build fiction from. But the reason I think your question is so insightful is in the short works, the sudden works of sudden fiction that I've been writing since lockdown, I feel like they're much more closely related to, they're fictionalised, but I feel like they're much more closely related to life. So, for example, that in terms of the broader story Hallway, I have a really big family, like a complete circus of a family. I have lots of children, and so and I too, Jen, am not the best sleeper. I'm a hero of nighttime things, which is the first line of the story. It's true. I don't sleep very well. So I feel like I was thinking about breathing a lot because it's an effect of the horror of this virus, isn't it? That people can't breathe, So I was thinking about breathing. I was thinking about the things we hear at night and how they are kind of amplified. And I relate to what you say, Jen, about them being sometimes amplified versions of the day. And then also at the, I'm sorry about that. I was just getting a funny voice message and I've just turned that off. I was also fascinated by what was happening in my hallway, which was a true thing. I had to move my office to home, and so I cleaned out under my bed and cleaned out my room to make room for the desk, and I put some things in the hallway, and then people added on. Other people in my house started kind of cleaning things out and putting it in the hallway. So the hallway became kind of this op shop of things that were unused. So I was bringing these idea of concrete and specific objects that were signs of our changed lives, and also this kind of breathing. And I was also haunted by people who were living alone, and I had some experiences of people I know well who live alone and were really suffering in that lockdown time. So I was very conscious that despite the frustrations of big family life, that I was also really lucky to have all these breathing people. So yeah, that's the long meandering answer, but the short answer is I think in sudden writing I tend to layer anecdotes from life perhaps much more closely than I would in longer works of fiction.
That makes total sense. And I've got to say, I'm so glad it's true. I really hoped it would be true. The objects in the hallway, it was such a great image, and just the things you can tell about even the people you know better than anybody else by the things they leave around and the sort of detritus, I suppose, of their lives. Ask another quick question. So a bit more about craft, I suppose. This piece is packed with wonderful imagery and is so emotive, yet it never feels crowded or forced. Do you have any strategies to achieve this beautiful balance that you've got going on? Like, how can we do that?
Wow, it's such a beautiful question again. I mean, I think that you really hit that, Olivia, when you talked about, and I think it relates again to this kind of acute listening. What does an object, any given object in a story, tell us about the person, the character that it relates to? And I think this is this kind of gorgeous idea of register of intelligence. Who's seeing and what are they seeing? Because if we all described exactly the same thing, like if we all respond to the given microfiction prompt, they're going to be so different. So I think what you're talking about is this paying acute attention to who's seeing and why do they notice, that particular thing. you know, why do we see what we see? How do we know what we know? So, I mean, I added things to that hallway pile, but certainly, but by thinking about this relationship between objects and metaphorical meaning, which I think is across everything. I'm conscious, I'm just going to do a bit of a time check. So we've got 15 minutes left, and from our perspective, we have one more round of stories, and I'd love to get to Jen's and Olivia's next one if we can, and we might just move our sort of questions and answers. We might cut them a little bit so we've got time for audience questions. So for our broader audience, if you would send through questions, and a reminder again, if you could send questions through to #EWF20, and we'll just keep chatting until some questions, and even if the questions come through and we mix them up in our questions, I'm sure we can be flexy enough to do that. So I'm going to return to Jen's work while we're waiting for audience questions. And I'm turning now to a story of Jen's called Don't Take Lightly the Descending of Night. Even the title, once again, you know, it's guttingly, superbly poetic. For listeners who would like to follow up and read this work in full, it's in Law Journal, LOR Journal. And Jen, I was wondering if you could begin once again by please, if you could begin again by please reading us a short extract, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and as I said, anyone is welcome to dive in with their own questions.
Sure.
Back to you, Jen.
One night, a second night, then a third in the garden shed. I dread the sound of footsteps on gravel. It's why I don't eat cereal. The crunching noise. It's why I can't explain why I suddenly become a ghost around people who eat cereal. Who in their right mind has something against cereal? Cereal is harmless. So are ghosts, mostly. The main difference between cereal and ghosts is that ghosts carry baggage. Cereal does not.
Okay, so this is a gut-wrenching story. It's a superbly crafted story, and it's a gut-wrenching story to read. I found this so moving and haunting after the fact. And I think for me, in terms of reading as a writer and writing as a reader, what I talk about as haunting are the stories that kind of stay with you forever. If I'm haunted by something, it's the reason I write. If I'm haunted after reading someone's story, that's the highest compliment I can give, even though it might sound like a dark word. It's a beautiful story. I wondered, Jen, if you feel comfortable doing so, if you could talk us through what the story is about and where it came from, or, you know, if you would prefer, given that, you know, the difficult subject matter, you could perhaps talk about how challenging it was to write that story, how challenging it is to write dark subject matter, something I've talked to authors a lot about, comes up in my own writing too. And perhaps discussing the evolution of sensory detail in this story. So like Olivia's question before, we've got these concrete and specific details in the story that become something much more, become sensory, associative and metaphorical. So any elements of that question that you would like to pick up on, Jen, please.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's a bit of a scary story, isn't it? And I actually didn't realize how scary it kind of was until we started talking about the story. So at its base, it's a fictional story about a child who gets locked up in the garden shed by the child's parents. But going deeper, it's a story about fear, physical and emotional fear, and of course the ultimate fear, the fear of fear itself. So like you were talking about before, Julia, how no fiction just comes out of thin air. The story itself was inspired by horror video games and the fear and sensory elements associated with playing a horror video game. So I was drawn to game mechanics, like things like running, hiding, holding your breath. In particular, 3 games, Amnesia, The Dark Descent, Death Stranding, and the Outlast series. Those games scare the hell out of me. So then I use similar mechanics in my story to hopefully scare the hell out of the reader. It's a dark and disturbing story for sure, so I always caution people before they read it. As for me, I don't find it particularly difficult. My approach to writing is that if I'm not having fun, then my enthusiasm will translate in the writing. So if I'm bored, then surely the reader will be bored too. I had a lot of fun writing this one, actually. And as you said, there's a lot of layering and fracturing going on. So I got to play around with it a bit like a puzzle. Yeah.
This might be a really good point, actually. We've just had a question come through from the audience, and I think it might be a really good question for you to address, Jen, and Olivia, feel free to chime in too, in relation to this fracturing, because this story is overtly fractured and, you know, signposted as a fractured work at the level of the sentence. But the fracturing also occurs through the weaving of detail, the layering of detail in the way that you talk about. So what one of the audience members would like to know is, do you think microfiction must have a beginning, a middle and an end? Why or why not? And maybe that's something that you might want to talk about here, Jen, on the back of fracturing, and we could use that as a lead into Olivia's next piece.
Yeah, sure. So do I think microfiction must have a beginning, middle and end? Like I spoke at the start of the session, the thing I love about microfiction is that it doesn't necessarily have to adhere to conventional storytelling format. But that being said, in my microfiction piece for 2018, it was like a stream of consciousness piece. It was kind of just like, you know, just writing down what came to mind. And that doesn't necessarily just make sense if I had just entered that. So I went back and made sure that it had a nice narrative flow going through it, that it made sense to another person. So what I did was I wrote it, and then I edited it, and then I put it away for a few hours, and then I went back just to make sure that it would make sense to someone else that, you know, just that wasn't living in my brain. So I don't necessarily think it needs a conventional beginning, middle, and end, but it needs to make sense to another person and have some kind of narrative flow to it.
If I could just add, sometimes for those flash fiction tiny ones, I started thinking of them as a beginning or an end. You could have a middle, like I think maybe some of them were just a middle, but it's sort of that jumping off point. And I have the context of the story, and I know that, okay, this, for example, the previous one of mine we talked about, it's kind of in fact, that one's sort of an ending and a beginning. It's like the ending of a relationship and the beginning of sort of freedom and a decision point. So I have that context, but then it's also the beauty of, I find, reading these two is that the reader brings their own context and brings their own context to the story and sort of makes up their own mind a little bit about what it could mean, what it could be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
And I think, I do too, and I think this question that you addressed there, Olivia, of beginning, middle and end is particularly interesting when we talk about flash fiction being the micro of microfiction. And this actually relates to the question that I had about your next piece. So I'm going to ask you to read that next one and then ask a related question, please.
All right, so it was day 15. The prompt was glasses, and this is my story. After the credits roll, scrub off the lip gloss, tie up my hair, put on my glasses. Makeover montage be damned. I'm fucking beautiful just the way I was.
So gorgeous. And once again, just this resounding voice. Superb. The question that I wanted to ask, which as I said, sort of jumps off the previous questioning, is when we're working in Flash, which is just so such a form renowned by brevity, right? In terms of deciding what to leave in, what to put in, and what to leave out, I wondered if you could speak to that, but as you did before, but also to discuss how what's in at the level of the sentence speaks to a broader picture. As you were saying in your earlier piece, you could have written a novel. In fact, you contained so much more than we think you could in a couple of sentences. So so that question of what to leave in and how it relates to what's left out, if you would, please.
Yep. I'm really glad you enjoy the piece, because I love this one, if I can say that about my own work, because I love teen movies. I love romance. I love rom-coms. I love teen rom-coms. And so there's that reference point, like we've all seen a movie where like the girl gets made beautiful by like straightening her hair and pulling out a ponytail. And so the ones I had in mind here were like She's All That or The Princess Diaries or something. And I think having that reference point makes it really easy to sort of boil it down to those few sentences. Because, and I think in this story in particular, that imagery I found really helpful. So, sorry. And I think actually with this story too, if I was writing something longer, that I'm beautiful, I'm fucking beautiful just the way I was, I probably wouldn't have written it that way with more context surrounding it. But I think, like we said, you don't have to go with conventional storytelling, and I chose not to go with conventional sort of grammar. So I think using the word was there gives that sense of there is a past, something, you know, big has happened. You know, it may not be huge in this story specifically, but, you know, going back to that previous state, just rejecting this idea that, in fact, I think this story, whether I intentionally did it or not, also talks about ableism, because this whole, you know, oh, you can't, you know, these, whether it's glasses, you know, I mean, lots of people wear glasses, but all this rejection of assistive devices or things that make you stand out and look different. There's the rejection of that rejection, I think. Should I talk more about the sentence? I'm not sure. I went on a bit of a tangent.
No, it was an excellent. I didn't find it a tangent. It was excellent discussion. What I think I'll do, because we've just got a few minutes here, I'm going to skip the last story of mine that we're going to talk about. It's called Cut the Angle. And it's, if anybody would like to read it, it's available. Also free access online in journal, The Incompleteness of Human Experience. And that story uses boxing. I love boxing. It's my favourite exercise. And I use boxing as a metaphor to. I wrote it after my last session of boxing before lockdown, and because of social distancing, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to box anymore. And so I started thinking about, and my response here is prompted by a gorgeous question that Jen sent through to me, was thinking about all the things that everyone went into a panic about what they weren't going to be able to do in lockdown. And so for me, ridiculous, you know, it's just exercise, boxing, but I do love it and it clears my mind like no other exercise. But I started thinking about that and observing, you know, my adult children's behaviour and the behaviour and discussion around people that I know and love well who were really frank about what they were and weren't going to be able to do. And I started thinking about these things in terms of intimate relationships. So that story is much more overtly fictional, and I use something I know very well, which is the activity of boxing, ducking and weaving and etc., to discuss more broadly, you know, lockdown and restraint and what that was, you know, everyone's fear of what that was going to mean. So I'm just going to read out these questions that have come in and ask you to pick, Jen and Olivia, any that you would like to respond to. Oh, and look, I've just got a little note up here saying that we feel free to keep going a little bit over 1:15. So I'm a bit laggy there. So, well, maybe I should. Maybe we'll just go back to read. I'll read a quick extract from that story. This is the boxing part. Cut the angle, gloves up, you're dropping your right, dance around, stay on your toes. Where's the follow through? Concentrate, land the punch beyond the target, punch through, cut the angle, swing from your hips, there it is. And this is all just kind of direct lingo when we talk about acute listening that this young 20-year-old trainer says to me when I'm training and encouraging me to box like a 20-year-old man, which I'm not. But so I use this kind of lingo, as I said, for a broader analysis of intimacy. Jen, you had a question for me about that. Have I answered that adequately?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it really links into a question we've received today that asks, what's the process for translating an idea into a full story? And I think you answered that beautifully.
Okay, yay, thank you. Thank you. So a couple of other questions that have come through I'm going to read out, and then I'm going to ask you, Jen and Olivia, to respond in relation to the work you've read today, or perhaps in relation to some broader storytelling that your problems you're trying to solve in your storytelling. So we've had this question about stream of consciousness. So one of our listeners is asking Jen about, yes, there's stream of consciousness, which we can think of sometimes as very reactionary form of writing. So to talk about the balance or the relationship between stream of consciousness writing and planning, which I think you have done in part. And also, okay, yeah, I'll get to that one in a minute in terms of journals and websites. We can all address that question maybe at the end. Translation we've covered. Okay, so that question together, stream of consciousness and planning, and also to talk about recommending journals and websites, etc., where our listeners might be able to find the work that we've spoken to today, or other short fiction that we've read and loved. So for me, I've just read a second collection of work called Sudden Fiction, and they are short stories. They're superb. And then in terms of free access online, Text Journal, and also I read all the Australian literary magazines. I think they're just the extraordinary resource. And if you have access to a library or a university library, I appreciate they're really expensive. You can get them obviously free access, some of those journals, through university libraries, and that's my birthday present to self every year, is the Australian literary magazines, because they're superb. So over to you, Jen and Olivia.
So I'll talk about the planning and stream of consciousness. So what I do, especially for the microfiction competition, is, it's a word prompt. So I'll write down everything that comes to mind associated with that word prompt. And then for each one, I'll write whatever comes to mind under that word. So whether it's just one line, one idea, a whole passage, I find that, after I have like a page or something, that there tends to be a common thread or a common thought that weaves all of those stream of consciousness writing that I've done. So then I kind of put it together like a puzzle, and that's probably the extent of the planning that I do. Yeah, hopefully that helps. Thank you, that person who sent in that question. As for journals, I recommend, I really like VoiceWorks. I think they do great short fiction, and as well as any short fiction that Seizure do, especially the winning entries in previous years for the competition.
I was going to say VoiceWorks as well. Yeah, that was my contribution. But you can find it like where you don't even expect sometimes. I've just come across, and I can't even think of any examples. Actually, often on my Twitter timeline, people are participating in something like the Writers Victoria Challenge, and there's another one that I can't remember the name of that seems to be going on. And it's just so lovely to have these tiny little stories just break up all the other junk I'm scrolling through on my timeline. So yeah, my other advice would sort of to be follow writing related accounts on social media, if you're not already.
So we have another gorgeous question, and this would be a good way to lead into wrapping up, I think. And it's a practical question about, how writers should get started on their pieces. And I think for me, I find that my writing's really reactionary, so I don't have. If I write, I'm not thinking a lot about where to get started. I feel like I'm responding to something that I can't really not write about. But I think in terms of my reading practice and my writing, starting with something really tangible that you know well in your life, and it can be the most mundane thing. So in that collection of Sudden Fiction, I read a story which was literally about a couple washing the dishes. Minute detail about how the man was washing the dishes and the woman's response. But what they were actually discussing while they were washing the dishes was thematically, the theme of the story was really about racism. And so if I set a prompt and said, okay, let's all write a story about racism, then that might be harder. But I think sometimes if we say, let's write a direct memory about the detail of washing the dishes, and then you layer a theme in like any theme of your choice. But this is what that story did superbly. And I guess that's kind of what I did with the boxing too. I wrote about the activity of boxing, which I know really well. And then I wrote about something I didn't know anything about, because how could we? And that is this new world of the pandemic and the things that we, the fear that we all have about what that new world looked like for us. So that would be my advice towards getting started. And Olivia and Jen, would you have a tip for our listeners about that?
I definitely agree with that advice, and sort of furthering to that, what I do sometimes when I have a prompt is I'll sort of think about and write down what it means to me, and like the word specifically, and then what it could mean broadly in terms of the world in general and humanity. And sometimes it turns out that I can combine both of those things into one story, and then sometimes I end up with two, and then it's deciding like which one to submit. But that's a different issue. But yeah, I think working out what you want to say about yourself or about your world and about the world more broadly is a really good place to start.
Jen?
My advice would be, don't go reading the other winning entries and get intimidated. Have faith in yourself. Enter every day if you can. Like I do every year. I enter every day. It's just good practice. But like Olivia mentioned before, if there's a prompt that you just don't resonate with, then don't force yourself. So yeah, have faith in yourself and have fun.
Absolutely. And
Such
if you don't
fabulous
win,
advice.
we're going to finish. That's all right.
No, not at all, Olivia. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I entered the flash fishing challenge every day, and I didn't win any day, but I felt so accomplished by the end of it. And it was just such a great feeling to have produced a new piece of work every day for a month, which is not something I can normally say for myself. So yeah, have fun, like Jen said.
It's also very interesting, isn't it? There's something very freeing about a prompt. This idea of sitting down to write, sometimes if we think, oh, I must sit down and write something, sometimes it can be very reactionary to write from a prompt. So I would say too, don't worry about whether you think the material that you're writing is any good. Just to write very freely, and then it doesn't even have to be submitted if you think it's purely awful, but I bet it's not. And so just to be writing from a very free space. Regretfully, I think that we're 10 minutes over time. I've had such a gorgeous time. I would like to thank Emerging Writers Festival for the opportunity to have shared time with these wonderful authors today. I'd like to thank my fellow panellists, Olivia and Jen, for beautiful discussion in the lead up to today and to today. And I would love finally to encourage all of our listeners to write, to enter the Microfiction Challenge, and I'd like to thank Going Down Swinging for co-judging and providing publication pathways for our authors. Happy writing. I think too, one of the really fascinating things is, as Olivia said, you might write something and you might enter every day and not win, but there's also this generative process where our own art generates art. And so some of the shorter pieces that I've written since the pandemic have become longer short stories because we start thinking into. So no writing work is ever wasted. Thank you, everyone, for a gorgeous time.
Thanks.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.